I would like to start with giving you the statistics of attendance. We were overwhelmed with the interest, and I think this is the biggest IGF so far. We issued 1,800 badges. So we have 1,800 participants here in this conference center who attend the IGF. Of these 1,800 people, 95 governments are represented, and the participants come from 112 countries. That means not, there are participants also from countries which were not represented at the governmental level. We were off to a good start. I will not go back to the opening day. We had a press conference there, and the minister briefed media and also Under-Secretary General Shah. Since then, we have started the substantive program. We have the main sessions in the summit hall. They are organized differently depending on the subject under discussion. Yesterday we discussed critical internet resources in the morning, that is the underlying physical and logical infrastructure of the internet. This was an issue which was very contentious in the context of the World Summit on the Information Society, and we were very careful in introducing this issue in the discussions of the IGF. We did not discuss it as a separate issue in Athens. We introduced it on the agenda in Rio, and then again in Hyderabad, where we had a panel first and then an open discussion. This time in Sharm el-Sheikh, we thought there would be no need for a panel to introduce the subject, as by now people on the whole know what they're talking about. So we only had an open discussion, a 3-hour debate with the floor moderated by 2 specialists. I just talked to one of the moderators who was here in the room to attend the previous workshop, and she was extremely happy how the discussion went, and she felt that issues that were almost taboo a few years ago were now discussed in an open, constructive manner. And the discussion was very issue-oriented, fairly free of polemics. Also notable that governments engaged in the discussion. This was one of the points that was often made, that governments don't feel comfortable in this IGF setting, which is very informal. The governments prefer a more formal setting where they can read prepared statements, and this was not the case yesterday. We had a very strong engagement of various governments in these debates. I will not try to summarize the substance of the discussion, but one notable event that was also commented as a step in the right direction was the affirmation of commitment signed by ICANN and the US government, and the end of the so-called joint project agreement, which means de facto the end of the oversight or of the contractual relationship between one government and ICANN, and now the new arrangement with the affirmation of commitments invites all governments to participate in the discussion on the improvement of the functioning of ICANN, and this was in general welcomed as a step in the right direction. There was also a discussion on enhanced cooperation. For those of you who have followed WSIS and the debate on internet governance, you may know what it means. To all the others, it must sound like a very arcane concept, but this was one of the Tunis outcomes on internet governance. There were 2 processes. One was the Internet Governance Forum, and the other one was a process towards enhanced cooperation. And there is an increasing feeling that, while I have to say that it was a diplomatic compromise, and diplomatic compromises are never all that clear. Different people mean different things when they hear the terms, because it was a compromise that made everybody equally happy or equally unhappy. But now what seems to be clear is also that the IGF is seen as a platform that contributes to this process of enhanced cooperation. In the afternoon, there was a discussion on security, openness, and privacy. This was in a way a follow-up discussion from Hyderabad. In previous meetings, we had discussed the various issues in separate session. Then after the second meeting in Rio, there was a general feeling that it was necessary to group linked issues, and security, openness, and privacy are clearly linked issues. What do you want is essentially the question: do you want security, or do you want openness without any security and keep your privacy? These are not easy questions. It was a very complex and multifaceted discussion. One of the panelists, one of the world's leading experts on security, Bruce Shire, talked of electronic common sense that needs to apply to this cluster of issues. But it is a discussion which is very difficult to summarize. It was very rich in all its facets, and it clearly does not have a clear-cut conclusion, except that it is also the responsibility of everyone, and you can only find valid solutions if you do it through multi-stakeholder cooperation. This morning we had a discussion. It was a very rich agenda on diversity and access. Diversity had two aspects: accessibility for people with disabilities and linguistic diversity. The chairman, Talal Abu Ghazaleh, questioned actually in his introductory remarks whether this was the right term for this session. He, as an Arabic speaker, he said, I don't want to be listed under diversity. I represent a language with a strong cultural addition. We gave the 0 to the world that allows digital communication. So he objected to the term, and at the same time he also said people with disabilities should not be referred to under diversity, which I thought was an interesting point. We have done this because we have always done this under diversity. We have our 4 themes: access, diversity, security, openness, and in addition critical internet resources. But it was certainly never meant to be discriminating in its use. And the session on accessibility for people with disabilities brought that up, that they also made the point that there is also great diversity among these groups. They have different forms of disabilities. I think this session was a strong point of the whole meeting. The panel demonstrated some of the tools that exist to help blind people, assistive technologies to help blind people navigate the internet. If it's done properly, there are standards there, and the speaker showed one good example of a website which allowed him, through the assistive technologies, could hear the reading, and that allowed him to navigate the page, and then a bad example where the voice just got garbled. And the panelists reminded participants that there are obligations. There's a UN convention on the right of people with disabilities, and at the same time there are tools available, and they presented a message they had worked out in the months leading to the meeting here, and this message was endorsed by the meeting with acclamation. I cannot report much on the session on linguistic diversity, but I know there was, because I had to go out to another meeting, but there was a speaker from Saudi Arabia who was involved in launching the IDN for Saudi Arabia in Arabic language. There was also a speaker from South Africa who had developed software for languages which were off the mainstream languages and which were not provided by commercial software developers. And then there was a session on access, which looked at the more technological issues of gaining access to the internet. Shall we ask for questions if there are any? Or are there any questions so far? This does not seem to be the case. Then maybe let me conclude by explaining a rather unfortunate incident which I don't consider to be a major issue. There was widely reported a poster incident or whatever it was called, and I think there were many misunderstandings involved. Let me maybe first start by outlining some principles and then also explain the fact. First of all, the UN was portrayed as stifling freedom of expression, and nothing could be further from the truth. The UN holds high Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which precisely guarantees freedom of expression. However, the UN has also to abide by certain rules, and the UN, as you know, the constitution of the UN is the Charter of the United Nations, and one of the founding principles is respect of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. And that brings me to the session in question. The organizers of the Open Net Initiative, I think they're called, had asked the Secretariat some time ago whether they could have a meeting room for presenting a book which I understand is not ready yet, but that's not the issue. We granted them that meeting room, and the meeting was scheduled on the first day in the afternoon, I think, of the first day, or I think they came very late, so they were given a meeting room when there were no other workshops there. And when we were about to start the orientation session, there was the delegation of China wanted to see me, and they pointed to a flyer the organizers had prepared, and the flyer on one side referred to the book that was the subject of the session in question, and on another page it referred to a film about the situation in Tibet. And the Chinese delegation objected to that. They said this was out of scope, this has nothing to do with internet governance, and also they did not accept that, as this would not be in line with the principles I just mentioned, that is national sovereignty and territorial integrity. We talked with the delegation of China, and we said we will ask the organizers to withdraw that flyer, but we will let them go ahead with the meeting, because we believe in the right of freedom of expression. And as I had to go on a panel, I could not talk myself to the organizers. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. I was not aware of every word that was exchanged between them, but I was told that they agreed to withdraw the flyer and they would go ahead with that particular meeting. Then, sometime afterwards, I was told that now a poster was up on the door, and then I asked that poster should be removed. And when the UN security staff went down, there was no poster on the door, but the poster was lying on the floor. And as far as I understand, they were filmed, and that film was then shown on YouTube, and the UN security was portrayed as having torn down the poster. That was not the case. But they told the organizers, they picked up the poster and took it up into their security offices, and they said the organizers could pick up the poster whenever they wanted. And they did so yesterday, and they also they signed the receipt, and they confirmed that the UN security did not tear down the poster. I think they have since corrected various statements that have been floating around in cyberspace. So there was the question of whether or not anybody can put up any poster, and this is maybe where the miscommunication has started, and maybe there were misunderstandings. But we do have a clear, I would call it, no poster policy. We do have an area in the conference hall, that is the IGF Village, where not-for-profit organizations can present their activities. But we don't open the village to commercial organizations, for instance. And you notice throughout the conference center there are no commercial posters up, and there are also no posters. I mean, most participants, I think, know the sort of basic rules. Maybe we failed in communicating these basic rules because we assumed that everybody would know them. But I just, if I can find it, I was given, I have it here, no, I have it here, sorry. A circular, for instance, of the rules that apply in the Palais des Nations in Geneva, that use of the Palais will only be granted for activities that are in keeping with the dignity of the United Nations, its purposes and objectives as defined in the Charter, and are strictly non-commercial in this respect. And also, it says very clearly that rallies and demonstrations are not permitted within the grounds of the Palais des Nations. And we apply the same rules, more or less, also to the IGF. We have to adapt the rules a little bit, as we are a multi-stakeholder setting, but we very clearly uphold the principle of non-commercial activities, non-commercial posters. I do recall that in Rio de Janeiro, I asked a big corporation to take their banners down when they had banners outside the workshop room. They did so without creating any major problem. They respected this principle. When we have the flag of the United Nations and the flag of the host country, we have these flags up and nothing else. And the basic rules are that if you want to provide materials, it should be shown first to officials of the United Nations whether it can be distributed or not. But we don't want to be the poster police and say this poster is allowed and this one is not. So we just adhere to a policy of no posters up. Whether or not there were other posters up, I think, as was claimed, honestly, I do not know, but I also refuse to go around rooms to control and say, here's a poster, take it down. I just rely, I think, on the responsibility and the discipline of participants to adhere to these rules. Once again, maybe we felt that now we're in the 4th editions, and we never had any incident of any sort. We felt that most participants were more or less familiar how this worked. But maybe we should have made this a little bit clearer, and we can learn from this to communicate this a little bit clearer. And of course, I'm also ready to talk to anybody who has issues with this. But I assume that participants will understand we have to abide by certain rules, and as long as we're under United Nations flags, we have to take seriously what United Member States think and what how they interpret the rules. I'm happy to take any questions, otherwise I leave it at that.